Welcome back to the Secular Homeschool Revolution podcast. This is a space for progressive secular homeschoolers who are questioning the systems that we were taught and reimagining what home education and parenting can look like. I am your host, Ashley. If you are new here, I am a homeschooling parent of 3 kids. I have a 13-year-old, a 9-year-old, and a 5-year-old. I've been doing this a while, and I'm also a co-founder of a really dope homeschooling cooperative that focuses on a decolonized education that is, of course, secular and inclusive. And I'm also now a co-founder of a micro school because we expanded our homeschooling cooperative to a micro school. So I am knees deep in this alternative education world. So before we get into today's topic, did everybody watch the Benito Bowl? And I get it if you don't support the NFL. I don't like it. But I watched that halftime show, and hopefully you were able to catch some clips on social media or YouTube because, I am still not over it. I experienced full body joy. I cried tears of just happiness. Oh, and when he gave that little boy that Grammy, I lost it because as you guys know, I've done several episodes on representation. That was a beautiful example of representation. I danced, I got my heart rate up, and when I thought Gasolina was coming on, I was telling my kids when reggaeton and gasolina first hit the radios, I was a different kind of mama in 2006 at these clubs. They were about to see something, but it didn't come on. But for me, it wasn't just the performance. It was the Latinidad on the main stage, and it was doing it so unapologetically. It was just beautiful, the showcasing of the pride and all of the cultural references. And I loved how history was showing up, and it was just so colorful. And then you had the sound and the movement and just all of these memories. And this is the kind of moment that reminds you that representation is not just a bonus, and it's not just cutesy. It is a message. And then, because there's always somebody, here comes the comments. Well, I didn't understand it. It was all in Spanish. And I'm going to say this I was going to say it with love, but I'm going to say it wholeheartedly, disrespectfully. That sounds like a you problem, not a performance problem. Because what you actually are saying is, I'm used to being centered. You're used to the world translating itself for you. You're used to culture showing up only when it's been made digestible and watered down and approved by only English-speaking comfort. And the wild part is, you guys will travel and take that same level audacity with you. Like when we were in Panama this summer, we went to hang out with my husband's friends in Panama City, and he was having meetings and stuff. But we went to the salsa club, and I don't know if I shared that with you. I might have shared it with y'all. But instead of going to bed to wake up at 3 a.m. to go to the airport to catch a 5 a.m. flight, we decided to go to a salsa club and stay up all night. I had so much fun. I was outside. It was an outdoor bar, live band. I sweated through my dress. My hair was all sticking to my face. I was going. And there were a group of Americans that came in and was expecting an American club experience, and was asking, when the band went on break, they were asking the DJ to play American only music. I was so embarrassed. Digest the culture. You are here. Anyway, or even going to different restaurants. You're a guest in their country and in their culture, and you're asking for English-speaking only waiters. That is mad disrespectful. So anyway, I'm off my soapbox. Our topic for today is, are grades necessary? Do we need to grade our kids through the letter system A, B, C, D, F? Because I feel like once you start unlearning the need to prove worth to institutions, you'll start seeing how deep that conditioning runs. And grades are part of the system. So let's talk about it. Let's do a slow zoom out on grades. So I always say on the show that understand something, we have to understand the system it's rooted from. So we have to ask, are grades necessary, and what were grades built to do, right? If we ask these questions, we can start trying to connect it to a system. Because grades didn't just appear out of anywhere and they thought, man, these would be a good idea to implement in education. Grades are a part of a sorting system, a ranking system, the system of who belongs where. And they were designed to categorize, compare, and move students through the institutional pipeline. And it depicts on who's advanced, who's average, who's remedial, who's mediocre, who gets opportunity. And that in itself is a system that has never been neutral, because grades have always been tangled up with things like class privilege, racial bias, ableism, and behavioral norms, because behavioral norms will reward kids who are quiet and compliant and easy to manage. But here's the deeper layer that I don't think any of us talk about nearly enough, is that grades aren't just about measuring learning, they're about conditioning behavior. So let's define conditioning. So conditioning is a psychological training. It's when behavior is shaped through rewards and punishments until it feels automatic. If you do X, you will get a reward. If you don't do X, you get a consequence. And over time, you start asking why you're doing X. You just do it because your brain has learned that this equals approval, this equals safety, this equals success. And that, my friends, is conditioning. So in school, in a traditional brick and mortar school system, we have to look at you get points for finishing the assignment, following directions, you get a praise. You're like, oh, good job, Billy. You don't challenge authority, you're labeled good, and you struggle and question and just move different, then you're considered a risk or you're labeled difficult. And, after 12 plus years of that in the system, you don't just graduate with knowledge, you graduate with patterns. And I know a lot of us are homeschooling because we pulled our kids from the system, or we've never introduced our kids to the said system. But it's still ingrained a little bit in us if we graduated from the system. So how does it show up in us as adults? We are afraid to try something unless we know we'll be good at it. We avoid risk because failure feels like we're shamed. And we also equate productivity with worth. The more we do, the more we produce, the better we are. And panic, like when we're getting evaluated, because what if we get a bad or low evaluation rating? Y'all, and just so y'all know, I get bad evaluation ratings. It's just because I'm always questioning things, and my managers in the past have not enjoyed my questions. I'm like, well, what is this system? Anyway, I've been a problem is what I'm trying to tell y'all. And also just we as adults sometimes need that external validation to make us feel competent. Even when we still need someone to tell us that. And that's not like personality quirks. That's like deep, severe conditioning. And grades teach kids early that learning is not about curiosity, but it's about performance. So listen to the language kids use. Like, is this for a grade? Is this going to be on the test? How many points is this worth? We've probably all said that if we went to traditional schools. And what is that saying? Like, what is missing from that? What do I think about this? How does this connect to real life? Why does this matter? What's the history of this? And, that shifts, that there's a shift that happens from curiosity to calculation. And that, again, isn't accidental. That's trained behavior. And here's what we have to be honest as homeschoolers. Sometimes we recreate grades at home, not because they're necessary, but because they make us feel secure in our journey, right? That's us replicating the system a little bit because that's what we've known. And we've been conditioned to understand that A equals success, B equals acceptable, C is a warning, D is shame, F is you are a failure with that big fat F in red marker. And our nervous system still reacts to those things. And that's because we've been conditioned, we've been trained. So when you ask, are grades necessary? What you might really be asking is, can I step outside of the ranking system and trust learning? Can I parent without replicating the reward and punishment model I grew up in? Can I believe my child is growing even if it's not constantly measured? If you can ask yourself that and get comfortable with it, that's part of the revolution, because decolonizing education isn't just about removing worksheets. It's interrupting the psychological training that says worth equals performance. Grades don't just measure your kid, they train your kid to measure themselves, to train themselves. And we're not raising kids to constantly rank themselves. We are raising kids to think. I know what y'all are thinking. You're like, Ashley, but how will we know if they're doing well? Take a deep breath. Because this is the fear question. This is fear speaking out loud. This is the one that shows up, and it's part of those like anxiety attacks I think we have chosen on this journey of parenting, right? Of, am I doing enough? Am I consistent enough? Did I make the right choice? Am I ruining my child? How are their grades? Are they on track? Are they behind? So we can unpack it. Why do we believe the only way to know they are learning is associated and attached to a letter? Who told us that? Because think about your own life. Did you need a grade to know you learned how to ride a bike, to cook a meal, to drive a car, to write something that actually meant something, to advocate for yourself? No, you knew because you could do it. You knew because it worked. You knew because you tried, you failed, you adjusted, and then you succeeded. That's feedback. That's learning. A grade is just a symbol, and symbols are easy because easy doesn't always mean accurate. So let's say this together as a collective. Real learning leaves evidence. So if your child can explain the concept, apply it in a new way, teach it back to someone else, use it in real life, guess what? They understand it. So I will say in my house, I deeply believe in the teach it back to someone else. And if you can explain it at my grown-up level, and then you can also explain it to your little brother, like my 5-year-old is getting the concept of multiplication, and it's not because he's just this bright kid that I've given A pluses to, but I have my middle kid explain her concepts to him, and he likes it because he thinks they're playing school, and she's actually like teaching him. And she's like, well, Lang, you just learned multiplication. So now he's like, I know multiplication. And he doesn't technically, but he definitely saw the application and the concept happen of like 2 and 2 and 2, right? And counted them the groups of 2. So those are seeds being planted, but it's also, and when things happen in that learning format, he thinks it's just so cool. His big sis is teaching it. And when it comes from mommy, I'm not always as cool as she is. But anyway, and so if they can't do any of those things, like explain it or apply it or teach it to someone else or use it in real life, that's information, that's data that you should be receiving. Don't look at it as shame, like, oh my gosh, they're failing at this. And another thing to look at is just like the growth mindset around grades, especially if your kids, and this is just something to peep if you pulled your kids from public school and they've known the system of grading, um, and how their brain processes the grading information, because they'll start, their brain automatically asks, did I get a good score? But what we want them to ask is, did I understand this? Because if they're asking, did I understand this? This takes away from the idea of transactional learning. They're also in performance mode, and performance mode kills curiosity, because now the goal isn't growth. It's approval. So when we say, how will they know they're doing well? We need to ask a better question. How will they know that they're growing? And growth looks like they're having fewer mistakes over time. They have a better ability to explain things. The explanation becomes stronger. They're more independent. They're asking deeper questions, and they overall have a higher level of confidence. Like, their confidence is increased, and growth is visible. You don't need an A to see it. You just need attention. And if you're homeschooling with intention, you're already paying attention. Now I want to hyper focus on when learning becomes a transaction. And it's going to get a little uncomfortable, but that's okay, because we know over here that growth comes from discomfort. So when grades become the center, learning becomes a transaction, and transactions change everything, because now the question isn't, what did I discover? It's, what do I get for this? So if I do the assignment, I get the grade. If I get the grade, I get the approval. If I get the approval, I feel safe. That is a loop, and it repeats year after year after year. And once kids internalize that loop, they start negotiating their curiosity. Is this for a grade? Does this count? Am I going to be rewarded? How many points is it worth? And if the answer is no, suddenly they're not as interested. They're not as motivated, right? The transaction's not worth doing. And it's not because they're lazy. It's not because they don't care, but because we've trained them that the effort without the reward is pointless. That's not intrinsic motivation. That's compliance. And we got to tell the truth. Grades don't just, quote unquote, motivate excellence. It creates anxiety and perfectionists, and it shuts down kids, and it makes the kids who feel behind less competent, less motivated. They have lower self-esteem, and then there's this like weird thing of comparison, and then there's the hierarchies, and then there's like identity labels that follow. I'm just not that smart, or I'm not the kid that's good at math, or I'm bad at math, or she's the smart one, I'm the creative one, or I'm not academic. And they're put in these boxes. That's not self-awareness. They're like getting branded. And once a kid ties their identity to performance, now mistakes don't feel like data. They feel like this is proof of who they are authentically as a person. That you're not good enough, or you're behind, or you're slow. You don't belong in the advanced group. And we act shocked when kids won't take risk. We act shocked when kids cheat. We act shocked when they melt down over a 92. A 92. But if you've trained your nervous system to equate grades with worth, of course they're going to spiral. I mean, some of y'all are still spiraling. You're still afraid to try something new unless you're guaranteed to be good at it. You don't want to look like, a goofball. You're afraid of failure, of like, what would that, F of failure look like for you at 40? It would shoot your confidence down, most of y'all. Don't let that be you. And, we need to process and hopefully understand that when we remove grades, we are not lowering standards. We are disrupting a system that confuses obedience with intelligence. We are saying we don't earn the right to learn. You don't perform for curiosity. You don't have to be ranked to be growing, because learning is not a product. It is a process. And when kids feel safe in the process, that's when they are bold enough to experiment. That's when they get all risky about being wrong. That's when they ask the bigger, scarier questions. And for me personally, in my humble opinion, I feel like that's where real education lives. Now, I know that some of y'all are thinking, okay, Ashley, this sounds beautiful and revolutionary, but like, what do I actually do instead? So next segment, we're going to talk about what assessments look like when it's rooted in liberation instead of ranking. Okay, so if we are not centering grades, what are we actually doing? And before someone says, oh, so this is a everybody gets a trophy thing. No, let me get on my soapbox for a second. First of all, the people who complain the loudest about everyone gets a trophy are usually the same people who built systems where kids are already competing for adult approval. Second, nobody is out here saying mastery doesn't matter. And what I am saying is humiliation is not rigor. Shame is not accountability, and ranking is not the same thing as excellence. The quote unquote everyone gets a trophy narrative is a distraction. It's a scare tactic. It's what people say when they don't know how to imagine standards without hierarchy. And I want to be clear and say not every kid has mastered every skill. Not every project is strong. Not every effort equals proficiency. And pretending that's true would be dishonest. And for me, the whole everybody gets a trophy trope is dishonest, because I feel like when we're looking and comparing it, especially with the grade system, in a grade-based system, when a kid struggles, they get labeled, period. They're a C student, an A student, or they're below average, they're behind. Those are labels, and labels stick. And then you got the other labels of like behavior and, who's a trouble or who's the trusted kid. That's part of the system. And in a mastery-based system, when a kid struggles, we say, you're not there, Nick. You're not there yet. Let's keep working. And that's not being soft. That's actually setting a higher expectation, because we're not letting you slide by with a 70 and calling it good with a thumbs up. We're saying you don't move on until you fully understand it. And that is harder. That requires persistence. That requires revision and resilience. And here's what the trophy crowd doesn't always understand, because real life does not care about your GPA. It cares if you can do the thing. Can you write clearly? Can you solve the problem? Can you collaborate? Can you adapt? Can you take the feedback and improve? And no one is handing out trophies in adulthood, but they're also not handing out report cards. So you either show up with the skill or you don't. So when people say not everyone gets a trophy, I agree. But I'll add this. Not everyone gets ranked either. Not everyone needs to be publicly measured to grow. You can hold high standards without building a hierarchy. You can expect mastery without attaching identity to performance. And you can tell a child, this isn't strong yet, without telling them you aren't strong. And that's the shift in language. That's the shift in support. And that shift requires more from us as adults. And, I feel like grades are easy, and a number feels decisive. It feels official. It feels controlled. And this requires engagement. It requires attention. It requires actual teaching. And if we chose homeschooling just to create or recreate ranking systems at home, then what are we doing here? What is the point? We didn't opt out of institutionalized schooling to build smaller institutions in our living rooms. We opted out because we believe learning could be different. So no, not everyone gets a trophy, but everyone deserves and gets dignity. Everyone gets feedback. Everyone gets the chance to improve without being branded. And that is not lowering the bar. That's raising it. And I'll even add, as someone, who helped and co-founded a micro school, we don't use grades even in our own micro school. We are feedback based, because we truly believe in, breaking down systems. But what about college? I know that's your next question, I'm sure. And even for the people who are outside looking in, it's either like one of the questions, I think top 5 outside of like socialization and can you teach is, what about college? And for some reason, people think that kids who were homeschooled cannot succeed or be accepted into colleges and universities. And that's not true. I didn't go and search a resource, but you guys are big people. Y'all are big and grown. Y'all can go and use the internet and search it yourself. But colleges actually really like homeschoolers, for lots of reasons, because they are good at independent learning. They're good at meeting deadlines. And so there are recruiters who do seek out homeschool kids. So anyway, I do feel like whenever you're challenging or questioning the system of grades, people like to act like admission officers, like they're UT Austin's admission officers. And they really don't get paid to be in your business. And I do want to say this clear. You do not need to grade your third grader like they are applying to Yale next week or Morehouse or Howard. And high school transcripts matter. Elementary panic does not. And here's what I feel like a lot of people don't realize. Colleges do not require that your kid gets ranked at 6. They do want evidence that they've had a rigorous education, that they're evidence that they're college ready, and that, that they have skills, and that's it. And there are multiple ways to show that. So one thing I'm really hyper focused on right now is narrative transcripts, because I feel like transcripts is where people get nervous. Me too, myself. That's why I'm hyper focused on it, because I got a 13-year-old and I got to start doing transcripts. Because I'm in Texas and it doesn't require record keeping. So I do keep loose records, but transcript level, is different. Because I feel like, why am I nervous about transcripts? I know people get nervous. I am too. But I think y'all think transcripts have to be this, spreadsheet of letters and numbers, or it isn't deemed quote unquote official. And I know that this is conditioning. I've experienced this conditioning. So if you think that, you've been conditioned as well. A transcript is just documentation. That's it. A narrative transcript. Now, these are really cool. I learned about them over the summer of different micro schools and homeschool cooperatives. This is the new wave of transcripts. So what is a narrative transcript? I will tell you that they actually tell the truth. So instead of giving instead of seeing like an A in U.S. history, right? In a narrative transcript, you can include like a short course description, and it'll explain like what was studied, what was produced, how was it assessed, and what skills were demonstrated, right? And what that does is it gives them admissions like clarity, depth, and understanding of the rigor. And so let me read to you an example. And so me and my co-founder Kia are really focused on how we can adapt our co-op, 2-3 semester, our session long classes for high school kids on how to give narrative transcripts for them. So anyway, let me break down one that I was practicing on. The course is African American U.S. history. The credit is for 1 at a high school level. The course description is which is where I'm going to put the narrative of the class. It's going to state Student examined U.S. history through a Black historical lens, centering African American agency through resistance movements and policy impact from the transatlantic slave trade to present. The coursework included primary source analysis, slave narratives, Reconstruction legislation, court decisions, speeches. Also, research on Jim Crow and its modern consequences and study of cultural movements from the Harlem Renaissance through contemporary activism. The student completed a research essay connecting a historical policy to a present-day inequity. They also created annotated primary source analysis and presented a project proposing a community-based response to a current studied civic issue. And the assessment was mastery-based and evaluated through written analysis, discussion, and project revision. And at the end, I would put an evaluation. So then it would say mastery demonstrated in historical reasoning, evidence-based writing, and civic analysis. Now, tell me that doesn't say more than a letter ever could. And a grade tells you how they performed on a test. Point blank, period. A narrative tells you what they can actually do. And the truth is, a lot of kids with perfect GPAs show up to college burned out. And they're so dependent on this external structure because they've never had to manage their own learning because they were just so ingrained in the system. And at the end of the day, colleges don't just want compliant kids. They want students who can think. And also, if your kid's on a path that includes dual credit courses, community college classes, AP equivalents, cleft tests, portfolio submissions, and standardized testing, if they choose, because you can absolutely layer in traditional documentation when it makes sense. But that should be strategic. And we want to make sure we're not using it in a fear-based way. We do not build 12 years of childhood around the possibility of admissions paperwork. And we have to be honest, not every kid is going to college. That's not a failure. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That is not lack of ambition. That's reality. But there's lots of other things to consider and offer. Trades, entrepreneurship, creative industries, public service. I feel like there are multiple pathways to adulthood that sometimes we can get tunnel vision on, that college is the ultimate end game. And we need to look at how we look at college. College is a tool, not a moral achievement. So when people say, but what about college? What they're really saying is, what about legitimacy? And what do we do with that? You have to understand your kid's education is legitimate, even if it does not look institutionalized. You are not required to replicate the ranking system to access opportunity. You are required to help them build skills, and that's it. And a skill can be documented without shrinking your kid down to a number, without systemizing your kid. So on today's episode, we have talked about why grades are not necessary in our homeschooling journeys and how they condition kids and us as adults, and how they turn learning into a performance, and even how to show mastery without ranking. But I want to bring it home with something honest. Grades were never about learning. They were about control. They have trained generations of kids to look for approval before the curiosity, and, to fear failure instead of using it as information. And, it took away this messy, glorious way of thinking, and they put it and reduced it down to a number in a chart. But real learning does not behave that way. Real learning looks like struggling, struggle followed by breakthrough, questions that led to more questions, projects that matter to the learner, conversations that build depth, growth that's visible over time. And none of that fits in the 0 to 100 scale. None of it. And if we want to be honest, we don't want kids who just perform. We want kids who think, who reason, who connect, who bridge ideas across disciplines, we want the builders, the inventors, the thinkers, not the reactors. We don't want comparers. And that's what assessments do without grades. It actually nurtures. And because the world doesn't care if you got an A, the world cares if you can do the work. And that's the assessment kids need. And before we go, one more thing. If you were paying attention to that concert by Bonnie, that happened at the football game, I know you saw something powerful. Here we have a guy whose entire discography is in Spanish, and it's so unapologetic. It's deeply rooted in his Puerto Rican identity, right? And then he got the opportunity to take one of the biggest global stages, and he did not shrink. He didn't translate himself for comfort. He didn't chase acceptance with English. And he didn't pack his culture into like sound bites or cameos. He celebrated it. He went off. And some people complained that they didn't understand it. I hope that was none of y'all listening. And that says more about them and like them centering themselves instead of actually acknowledging and giving the moment to the art that happened. And what I want you to take home with you today is your kid doesn't have to fit into someone else's measurement system to matter. They don't have to perform for approval. They don't have to shrink for understanding, and they don't have to apologize for being whole, messy, complex human beings. Because that's what's really beautiful about us as humans, right? And Bad Bunny didn't dumb down his identity to be digestible. He turned that into power, into unity, into celebration, into love, in a moment that people, even those who didn't get it, could not ignore. And that's the same approach you should take with your homeschooling. Don't offer less rigor, not easier standards. Not everyone gets a trophy softness. And that's what I want you to take. I'm not discounting grades because I want you to offer your kids less. I'm challenging you to offer them more because that's the real education. And that's the revolution. And that's what this show is about. And thank you guys for being here. And I thank you for listening to the Secular Homeschool Revolution. And this show, this isn't where we don't just question systems, but we change the way we think about learning entirely. And if this episode gave you courage or made you rethink some things or challenged you, please share it. Share it with a friend, because I think we need to have these conversations. The evolution of education is happening in traditional schooling. It's happening in homeschooling. It's happening at, big stages like colleges and universities. So let's have the conversation. Until next time, I want you to stay uncompromising and to stay curious. And as Benito reminded the world, you don't have to translate yourself to be heard. Stay revolutionary.